Before we start the day, I'd like to take a moment to thank all our sponsors. The festival is proud to present Z Entertainment as the title partner, Nexa, who has come on board for the very first time as our associate partner, our venue partners, Rajan Kilachand and Bank of Baroda, JCB Prize for Literature Bookstore, managed by Full Circle, our cause partners, Dettol Banega Swatch India, Black and White, our celebrations partner. Thank you to Jan Mikalski, Aga Khan Foundation, Getty Foundation, J. Paul Getty Trust, British Council, Nordic Lights, Mahindra, World City, Dove, Airtel, Kingfisher, Grover, CK Birla Hospitals, Avid Learning for believing in the festival, and continuing support. New partners this year, Population Foundation of India, Child Labour Free, Jaipur Initiative, DMI Finance, Dell, Sun Village, Air India, Ola, O2 Sparkle, and Swami. Our publishers, Penguin, MIT Press, Westland, Oxford Dictionaries, Murthy Classical Library of India of Harvard University Press, and HarperCollins. The future of every festival depends on its growing relationship with existing and new audiences. And I would like to thank our media partners, Red FM, and Rajasthan's very own Patrika Group and Bhaskar Group for their generous support year after year. Our new partners, Business Standard, Outlook, and DNA. Our social media partners, Facebook and Twitter, for increasing our reach to the world. Vayus, Wattpad, and Launchora, our podcast partners. Please find tickets. Please find tickets to recharge your evenings at the Jaipur Music Stage. We have the very exciting Noorani Sisters and Indian Ocean playing at Clark's Amer this evening. You can find your tickets either online at Book My Show or at tent number 2 outside the Diggy venue. Now for the first of our day's delights. Program number 36 on your sheets, presented by J. Paul Getty Trust Series and Women Uninterrupted Series to speak on Empress Noor Jahan and the women of the Mughal Empire. Please help me give a warm Jaipur welcome to Ira Mukherjee, Ruby Lal, and Parvati Sharma.
Hello. It's working? So it's a real pleasure and a privilege for me to be here today talking to the authors of 2 books that I have hugely enjoyed in the past few months. Ruby Lal is a professor of South Asian history in Emory College and an acclaimed historian of Mughal India. Her latest book is a wonderfully readable account of the life and times of Noor Jahan, who was the last and favorite and most powerful wife of the Emperor Jahangir. And she builds a wonderful portrait of this remarkable woman, and also building upon, in this process, her earlier academic work on domesticity and power in the Mughal world, which re-examined the idea of the Mughal harem and its role that it played in the Mughal state. Ira Mukherjee is a scientist by training, though fortunately for us, she has come to the world of history and is writing lovely books. The first was a book called Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History, during the course of which I think she encountered one fascinating woman, Jahanara, which then led to her more recent exploration of called Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire, which is a wonderfully panoramic view of some of the some really amazing and yet unknown women who had tremendous influence in the lives of the early Mughal emperors, whom we know very well, though we don't know their sisters, their wives, their mothers, who played a role in their governance and rule. So both of you have lovely insights and stories to relate, so I'll get to you immediately. You have both, I want to begin by asking, you have both written about individual women, of course, but you have also written about the Mughal Zenana, the harem. And in this way, I think it's, it's said, and rightly, that not enough is written about women in history. But when it comes to Mughal women, there's a slight quandary in that argument. Is that, in fact, there is quite a bit written about Mughal women and Mughal harems, except much of it was written by Orientalist travelers in the 17th, 18th century, Europeans who would present often salacious, rumor-based accounts of what they thought was going on inside the private women's chambers, and these were accounts that presented the Zenana as a place of lassitude and sort of unbridled sensuality. And both of you re-examine that and present the Zenana instead as a place, a vibrant arena of politics, of art, of aesthetics, of poetry, of business. So to begin with, I'd ask both of you to perhaps, could you paint us a picture of how you understand a Mughal noblewoman's day might have gone, typically?
I'm sure you can hear me. I can hear the vibrations. First of all, I'm really delighted to be on this panel. These are my Mughal kin, so it's rarely you have women as Mughal kin coming together. So I'm really delighted, and thank you to all of you for coming. I just want to start very quickly by making a distinction between the harem and the zanana. The harem is the term that's used in Mughal records all the time. Without going too much into the detail, the important point is that there are very vibrant associations of power with the harem. The space is significant, but it's the power that's really quite incredible. So whether the Mughal women in the early days were actually not in the walled harem, but constantly on move, these were nomadic women from the steppe traditions of Central Asia, Afghanistan, and then on to India. There were notions of respectability. There were notions of female existence and male existence with great connections and overlaps. But nonetheless, the power remained. So the harem is a very distinct usage. The idea of the zanana, of course, comes later on. But without getting into all those details, let me paint a little picture for you from the life of the great Mughal princess, Gulbadan Bano Begum, who was the daughter of Babur, sister of Humayun, and aunt of Akbar the Great. The only woman who wrote her memoir in the entire Islamic world, and we are not just talking about the Mughals, we are also talking about the Safavids of Iran and the Ottoman Turks. And it's a wonderful memoir for many, many reasons. But the snapshot here is, imagine that the first harem has been built in Mughal history in Fatehpur Sikri. It's in red sandstone, highly walled, separated from the Daulat Khana, which is the court. And imagine the young 30-year-old Akbar, 30 bordering on to 31, going behind the walls. It's a wonderful setup. His mother, now the elderly matriarch, Hamide Bano Begum, will be there. There'll be other attendants, but it's a very special meeting. Sitting across from him is this vibrant woman with penetrating deep eyes, wearing a long kurta, flowing trousers, stole slightly on her head, not covered. The penetrating eyes is really interesting. She's not one of his many wives. She is his aunt, Gulbadan Bano Begum, ready to set on a flight. So they sit together and she informs him that she has a desire to go on the Hajj. She leads 13 women on this 3.5-year-old journey and stay in the Red Sea area. A lot happens. I've recently found some amazing records about what happens in those 3.5 years. The small point is, and I'll let Ira come in and speak. The small point is that the haram is built and she's out of the haram on a flight of wonders. So this is a daily scene. This is not just one exceptional scene.
Hello, is it on? Thank you for having me here. Thank you everyone for coming here. And it's awesome to be in the company of one of my heroines, in fact, Ruby Lal, and of course Parvati. The point I wanted to make, since Parvati has asked this question of what is a typical day in the life of a Mughal princess or noblewoman, is that the way in which I see it in the book I've written is that there really isn't one single way. And the idea we have of the zenana or the harem, of this cloistered space in which women were spending endless hours beautifying themselves, indolent, waiting for the pacha to cast a glance in their direction, and mostly spending their time bickering and in petty jealousies with one another amongst women, as of course we know women can only be petty and jealous of each other. This is really not at all the way it was. So I will very briefly tell you a few lives to show you actually there was no one way also, because in the 200 years of the great Mughals, this kept changing. So like Ruby Lal has said, in the earlier Mughal women had a lot of physical freedom. So if we can have slide number 8, please, Tarang. Somebody like Hamida Banu Begum, whom Humayun met when she was just a 14-year-old young woman and who he was determined to marry. She finally acquiesced after Dildar Begum spoke to her at length and convinced her to get married. She wasn't very keen initially. I think this may be Ruby's presentation. The other presentation, please. That's fine, that's fine. So Hamida Banu, when she married Humayun, Humayun was in the throes of losing his kingdom to Sher Shah Afghan. And he was indeed fleeing away from Hindustan at that time. Hamida Banu joined him at this time. As a 14-year-old, she immediately got onto horseback, followed her husband, got pregnant, with the great Akbar, had him as a 15-year-old, again well, maybe not literally on horseback, but while she was traveling through the countryside, harassed by, the people, the enemies of her husband. And then she went on to spend 2 years in exile in Persia, where they were almost like itinerant tourists. They were visiting all the great sites of Persia, which Humayun was very interested in. So Hamida spent these 2 years sightseeing, looking at these sites, understanding Persian culture, attending the court of the Persian Shah, and this wasn't at all the way a typical zenana had been portrayed to me when I was growing up here in India. So this is a scene of Hamida Banu when she arrives back in Hindustan, when she has become a widow. Humayun dies very early. Akbar there is bowing to her, as he always was, very respectful to his mother. She is in the palanquin. As you can see, we can clearly see her face. She is not veiled to the extent where we can't see her. And this is how she spent a great deal of her time, in palanquins, on horseback, traveling. So this is a very different idea of a zenana or a harem. The second person I want to talk about very quickly is Harka Bai, the woman who is known erroneously in popular culture as Jodha Bai. There was, of course, no Jodha Bai. She was not the princess of Jodhpur. Akbar's main Rajput wife was from here, from Kachwaha of Amber. So she was Harka Bai. And if we can have image number 5, I think. She was also a remarkable woman. She was completely written out of history because by the time Akbar was older, he had been joined by Abu al-Fazl, and Abu al-Fazl had decided that Akbar was to be a divine king, and therefore he had to have a very orderly zenana or harem, and it was absolutely not orderly. It was chaotic and boisterous. So it was completely written out of records. We do not have a record even of her name, Harka Bai. So this is an image of her. So it's the mother of Jahangir, Salim, later Jahangir, and she's the woman in the center with the dark complexion. And those of you who know Jodha Bai will agree that she does not resemble Aishwarya Rai in the least. So my point being again that Harka Bai, who has been so terribly written out of history, had this amazing life where she gave birth to the future prince and went on and became a very influential and powerful and wealthy woman. She traded, she had her own trading ship, so her life was not a typical one the way in which we imagine it. So these are just examples to show that there wasn't really that typical life of the zenana where the women, are just cosseting themselves and putting on much ittar and perfume and, changing their clothes every hour.
In fact, the women that you mentioned are both Gulbadan and Harka Bai were in Akbar's harem. And Akbar's reign is remarkable for many things, perhaps also remarkable for having some of the most powerful women during the reigns of the early Mughals. I mean, there was his mother, of course, Hamida Banu, who grows from a teenage, wife of Humayun into this venerable matriarch. There was his cousin and wife, Salima Sultan. There was Gulbadan, whom you've talked about already, and you've worked extensively on her in your first book, and I'm happy to know that you're planning to work more on her in the future. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about her, this journey that you talked about that she takes?
Sure. I mean, actually, I'm here to talk about Noor Jahan, but I think it's very important to talk about Gulbadan. I mean, not least because she's my first love. And she's very critical to thinking, and this is where I really began. When I was a young scholar getting ready to go to Oxford to do my PhD, a leading historian of Mughal India, who I still refuse to name, said to me, "How are you going to do this? There are no sources for it." And it's a classic problem that's posed to anybody trying to do something different. But I think the problem is much bigger because we knew Gulbadan Banu Begum's memoir, the great record keeper, the only copy of her manuscript, and I was the last scholar to see it in physical terms. It's very fragile. It's in the British Library in London. So we knew about this manuscript, and in fact, one historian who had written about what the sources are, what they can do, had a footnote on this woman saying, "We know all there is to know about her, and how do we know it? Because Annette Beveridge had translated the memoir in 1902. He further noted that it only depicts the soft society of women. So I went ahead, looked at this memoir. It's actually really pretty breathtaking. It's breathtaking for many reasons. The first one, by the time she comes back from the Hajj that I was talking on earlier on, Akbar decides, as part of his indomitable ventures, that he wanted to have the first history of the empire written so that progeny and everybody else will remember him how we remember him as Akbar the Great. And this was the history called the Akbarnama. He invited the best memory holders from his household and elsewhere to record the memories of their forefathers as a contribution to the Akbarnama. So Gulbadan Banu Begum wrote, in terms of style, in terms of content, completely unparalleled record. It's all about women contesting with men, saying, why are you going to see all these aunties? Why don't you spend time with us? Or, endless records of children that were being lost. Now, I'm not trying to just give you juicy details. I'm actually trying to bring to life for you that this was a nomadic princess. She was a migrant. She had always been on the road. She was born in Kabul. She comes to India at age 5. She's the first Mughal girl to come to India. And she witnesses the empire as it's being formed, as bricks are being laid, as gardens are being constructed, as laws are being laid down. So it's a history in motion. It's a history in making. Who's Akbar the Great? He is by that time settled, imperial, indomitable, getting ready to be the next millennial sovereign. He's not going to have this. And so it's a very contestatory record, but the record keeper of this, the record-keeping tendency of this woman is just really one aspect. As I've been saying, what she does for 3.5 years on the Red Sea is really pretty phenomenal. There were 6 edicts issued against her, which I've just found. And in each of those, it is said that she was indulging in un-Islamic activities. And these are really wonderful un-Islamic activities. So, this is not a pietous old lady, going on the Hajj in order to, really, make her nephew ambitious. That is part of it. That's the language she's going to use. But there's something else in this whole story. So I just think she's a magical thinker. She's cerebral, and she embodies this whole idea of migration. It's migration not just in the body, but it's in the mind. It's creativity. It's personifying change. All of these things are pretty essential. But these are also really how I approach the record, how I think about the record. And I'm hoping that we'll have more chance to talk about, some of those nitty-gritties of history, which I think we should know.
Well, the other great migrant is, of course, the other great migrant is, of course, Noor Jahan, who comes from Persia to Hindustan. So coming to her, and to both of you, this question, in a way, of course, she follows in the footsteps, one might say, of these illustrious predecessors. Her Hamida Banu, Salima Sultan, Harka Bai, and others, many others that, Ira, you've written about in your book. Would it be fair to say that this is a sort of that she is the logical culmination of a kind of, a kind of family that, or a culture that allows for, women to have power? Or would you both say that there is something quite unique about her?
Should I give a little bit of insight, or would you want to start?
Should I speak about Noor Jahan?
Whether she was unique or whether she came upon... You want to start?
Let me start.
Sure.
I'll just, there's a lot I can say, obviously, about Noor Jahan, but it's a great question. I think what Ira and I have been referring to is really the tradition of matriarchal power here. And obviously, Noor Jahan comes into that setup. But there's a couple of things I'll say about Noor Jahan. One is we should remember that she's not from the Mughal family. She's the daughter of Ghayas Beg and Asmat Begum, who are Persian migrants to the Mughal court in the late 1570s. So she is of aristocratic background. All of that is absolutely true. But there are very precise enunciations of her sovereignty, which is why I have launched her as a co-sovereign. Let me just show you one very quick slide, Tarang, the first one. This is a painting that's held at the Rampur Raza Library in Rampur, recognized by art historians as the image of Noor Jahan. In this image, she's loading a musket, and the painting is known to have been cast between 1612 and 17. It's one of the few women-oriented paintings in which the painter laureate, Abul Hassan, the finest portrait maker, inscribes his name. But just a couple of things. She was one of the best shots of the empire. She hunted tigers. She killed several man-eating tigers. There's copious records of that, not only in the Jahangirnama, but several other documents of the time. Hunting was lawfully to be done by the sovereign. So this is, I bring this painting up to show to you that this is actually a technical sign of her sovereignty. There are several others. She mints coins in her names. There are imperial orders that are issued. Again, a lot to be said about this painting, but really there is a departure that takes place. So my plea to you would be that from now on, when we talk about the great Mughals of India, let's just remember there was one woman amongst them, and that's Noor Jahan. So I think that's the response. Sorry.
Thanks for that, Ruby. I think the way you speak about Noor Jahan just changes the way we look at women and power and co-sovereignty, really. My take on this is that I have written about 15 women, through 200 years of Mughal history. And two of the women I did not want to, I wanted to talk about women that we did not know much about, bring it into popular consciousness, women we may not have ever heard about in our school textbook or in a way which had completely changed their legacy. So two women that I did not want to speak about were Noor Jahan, Mumtaz Mahal, because they were the best known of the lot. Now, Noor Jahan, I found as I was doing my work, I had to include, because her talent and the way in which she exercised her power was, you could not miss that, and there was no way you could avoid that. Mumtaz Mahal, my publisher, convinced me to write about her, because everybody wants to know about Mumtaz Mahal. What I found and what I was concentrating on in my books was the way power was exercised by these Timurid women. As Ruby has said, Noor Jahan herself was not a Timurid woman. The others, the women I have spoken about, except for Mahamanga, were themselves Timurid women carrying the Timurid bloodline. And so I wanted to show that for most of the women that I have written about, this Timurid bloodline was extremely important, and they saw their role in furthering their legacy as Timurid princesses was something that they were seeking to do and were actively doing. And several of them did that, but the one who did it with the most panache, with the most ambition, and with the least self-effacement, in my view, is Jahanara Begum, Shah Jahan's eldest daughter. And she was able to do so much with her time, with her wealth, with her influence, that it is a complete crying shame that today she is completely forgotten. And in Delhi, the city which she helped to create with Shah Jahan, because as you know, when Shah Jahan established Shah Jahanabad in 1638, he began this project. All that he built was the fort and the walls, and later on the Jama Masjid. All the other great, Mughal buildings, whether they were the bazaars or the caravansarais or the hammams and the other masjids, were built by his daughters, his wives, and the noblemen who wanted to take this forward. And a great section of Old Delhi was built by Jahanara Begum with the aim to further her legacy. She has her name written out on the caravansarai so that all the great travelers from all around the world, because these were not backpackers who came to stay in these caravansarai, it was only the most elite of the travelers. So when they went back to their home countries, they would have read those signs and have remembered her name and carried her fame forward. Today, of course, she's almost forgotten because all those buildings were destroyed in the 1857 uprising. So Jahanara Begum also wrote 2 books, later than Gulbadan, but also a remarkable account from a 17th century Muslim woman. And she is able to elucidate her ambition so clearly as a Sufi princess, because the Sufis were very associated with the Timurid royal line. So she, through her Sufi work, was saying, I too am a Timurid woman. I too am leaving my legacy by penning down my thoughts and my Sufi mystical experiences. So it's important, as Ruby says, to examine these things and place them into context and understand them for the powerful symbology that they really represent. So to add to Rubilal, I would just say that there were other women doing that, maybe not so spectacularly and never as co-sovereigns, but they were able to do extremely ambitious and powerful things, especially Jahanara Begum.
In fact, talking of Jahanara, one of my favorite bits in your book, Ira, is when you describe, the rivalry between Jahanara and her sister Roshanara. And there is, in a way, we are used to thinking of the Mughal kings as, constantly locked in a kind of rivalry. As the empire grows, as the stakes get higher, the rivalry becomes increasingly bitter and bloody. And, then we have, famously, of course, Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. But as you show, there was an equally strong and perhaps equally consequential rivalry between their sisters, Jahanara and Roshanara.
Yes, that's right. And, initially I was thinking of writing this book just as the Battle of Succession, placing it in this time period, just to show Jahanara and Roshanara. We are so fascinated by this. And as you say, in the Timurid succession, there is no law of primogeniture. So the eldest prince does not become automatically the king, which meant that any prince, any brother of these women could envisage becoming king one day. Therefore, the women and the sisters who were associated with them invested heavily in one or the other brother, because they figured that their time would come along with this brother, this sibling, right, would bring them into the Zanana, perhaps as Pacha Begum. So Jahanara and Roshanara were very implicated in this. Another thing is that Shah Jahan clearly favored Dara Shikoh and Jahanara. You know, he very openly favored them. In today's day of parental super awareness, we would not do this. We would not favor a child over another. Shah Jahan had not read all the guidebooks. So he openly favored Dara Shikoh. He allowed him to have the crimson tent of royalty. He kept him close to himself at the court. So it was very clear that he intended Dara Shikoh to become king after him. And therefore Jahanara was treated in the same way, and she completely assumed that Dara Shikoh would one day be king, and she would be close to him, and she would exercise that kind of power. Roshnara, had a longer-term vision, perhaps, and she placed her bet on Aurangzeb, and they were very close. Those two siblings were very close. Dara Shikoh and Shah Jahanara were close. And what's amazing is that these women sent out letters. So there's all this correspondence between the women in the harem and the princes, whether they were at court or far away on battlefields, like Aurangzeb was. And the women are sending out important information, as Roshnara was. Roshnara was saying, Dara Shikoh is saying all kinds of crazy, absurd, un-Islamic things. He's going to get into trouble one day, So Aurangzeb, no matter that he was in the Deccan or elsewhere far from court, he was getting all this very important information from Roshnara Begum. And so these two sisters, unfortunately, became pitted against each other, and had a lifelong rivalry. When finally Dara Shikoh was killed and Roshnara Begum, became the first woman of empire, it's interesting that Aurangzeb did not make her Padshah Begum. Somewhere in his mind, his eldest sister, Jahanara, was still the most influential and respected woman, which is something astonishing and tells us something about Jahanara's presence. And when Shah Jahan dies and Jahanara is brought back to the court, she is made Padshah Begum, not Roshnara, who had been his lifelong ally. So it's extraordinary. Not only that, she's allowed to live in a haveli outside the court, something that Roshnara had been begging to be able to do, to live outside the Qila, outside by then it was there were many more strictures on the women. She wanted to live outside, and she was forbidden. But Jahanara, as an unmarried single woman, was allowed to live in a haveli in her own sort of entourage and with her own people outside the Qila. So yes, an extraordinary time between these two women, and somewhere I feel a little sad for Roshnara Begum.
I felt very sad for Roshnara, yes. But Ruby, you hint at also sort of a political rivalry between Noor Jahan and Jagat Gosain, whom one imagines would have exercised a great deal of power, being the mother of Shah Khurram, who would become Shah Jahan, and who was for a long period his father's favorite son. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The question is about rivalry between Khurram's mother and Jagat Gosain and Noor Jahan. The structure of the harem, was feudal. There are many wives. And these are all dynamic women, as Ira has been saying, one way or another. The point is, in the historical record, you do not hear about the rivalry. It's in the public imagination, it's in the legends that this comes up. And I believe that the issue of rivalry, that'll be inevitable. I think that's some sort of tension, some kind of arrangements, negotiations, as Gulbadan tells us, right? These are likely to be there. But I think my whole work here has been to not focus on that issue of jealousy, because I think that is the old trope, into which we very easily cast women. There'll be rivalries, there'll be tensions, there'll be jealousies. That is human history. I think that is likely to be there. So I lean on legends to bring something of the character of their life together. But historically, there's really, nothing to go in terms of documentation. What I do want to focus upon, there are all these kind of classics, old classics on the Mughals, on the emperors, and mainly on the emperors, which are the lives and times genre. Now, we all have lives and times, but I think it's a pretty wobbly, way to proceed. And my editor and I in New York, we really struggled with what to call the book, and we called it The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan. I think it is really important. What the document is telling us is the reign. It's telling us about her ascent as co-sovereign. So with all of that, that is an incredible point to highlight. We have, there's a lot of stuff we can show here. Could we have, I think it's image 3, Tarang? Further down, please. These are the coins. This is the Nishan of Noor Jahan Begum. This is the one. This is an image in the Harvard collection. When it was acquired, it was established that this is Noor Jahan Begum. Now, how do we know that this is a Jharoka image, by the way? And the way in which it was cast is it's a pin that is to be put on the turban. And usually these pins were given to aristocracy and other officers as symbol of loyalty. So this is actually a much bigger picture than than it actually is. Jharoka, classically, you have to understand the art historical move into this. Whenever there's an arm on the balcony, that's suggestive of the Jharoka. So when it was acquired, the painting was listed as you can see, a miniature portrait of Noor Jahan to be worn as a jewel. But this is a Jharoka image, another informal symbol of authority. Of course, this comes with Akbar the Great, coming out of Indic traditions of viewing the goddess or the goddesses. Noor Jahan is Akbar the Great's daughter-in-law. He had just built the harem. He had declared them for the first time in imperial history as Pardegyan, that is the veiled ones. And within 2 decades, you have a daughter-in-law, not from the family, who's on the Jharoka. So I think, it's really important. It's important to keep in mind the human history, right? And I chart that human history, the wider context, the structure of the harem, the life in the harem, as you talked about. But nonetheless, I think this is the moment to really, for all sorts of wider politics. I mean, when I speak about her in the US, this is not Hillary Clinton, but people find resonances with how a woman's moment is getting lost, right? Why is it that we don't understand that issue of power? It's however much you have it, you can have any number of sources, but there are still questions around it. So I think it's a really important political moment to claim, Noor Jahan as this great, ruler.
Is it also, to both of you, do you think, you talk about the political moment to claim Noor Jahan, that's a very, very, very good, it's true, we are in this moment where general politics is evolving, and to remember somebody like Noor Jahan now is very useful to us. Is it in this context perhaps also useful to think of the Mughal men, and say specifically Jahangir, as one might call him an ally today, Was that how both of you would see him, or the Mughal men generally, Akbar, Babur, beginning with Babur and his, a great admiration for his grandmother's strategic skills.
Sure. It's a lovely question, and again, Parvati has written a very beautiful book on Jahangir, just in case. I've been saying to her that after this, we should really claim the love story of Noor Jahan and Jahangir. We should really write it, because love has, trapped them and truncated, particularly her life as sovereign. But absolutely right. I mean, I think this history is not the best gender history. Gender is actually gender does not equal women. Gender means relationship between men and women. So this whole history is in alignment with men. Jahangir is I'm sure you want to talk about Jahangir, but, I've been fascinated with him. And one of the readers of my manuscript said to me, Ruby, you need to hold back Jahangir because he's this amazing figure. He's, he's driven. I mean, this is a curious personified figure who loves the Vedanta, who loves, he has the scene that I don't forget in the Jahangir Nama is that they are based in in Gujarat, and the cavalcade is about to move back to Agra, and he's been keeping these a couple of trains whom he calls Laili and Majnu after the famous lovers in Islamic history. And so when the cavalcade, and the figures are something between 50,000 to 350,000, so this is a whole city that's going back. Laili and Majnu are right in the front. It just tells you something about the poetic character of this deeply moody and philosophical king, right? And I'm mentioning this because one of the tendencies, speaking of Babur, Jahangir really very deeply contests Akbar's authority and really begins to shape himself like Babur, the poetic, wandering king, which is why this couple is so much in movement. And I believe that movement, that peripatetic character of life, contributes to co-sovereignty. So yes, there are these incredible men, even Khurram, Shah Jahan, right, who's very closely in alignment with Noor Jahan in the early part of their relationship. But of course, history takes over, feudality takes over. but yes, absolutely.
I'll just add a couple of lines to that to say that, when we write the histories of women, it is in no way an attempt to bring down the men or to make them less important. And seeing a woman's influence on a man, or to see how a man treated a woman, whether his mother, his grandmother, his aunt, or his wife, does not in any way emasculate him or make him a less good king or man. So that's just an aside. And for example, Babur, since you mentioned Babur, in Gulbadan's wonderful biography, which Ruby Lal has told us about, she writes about the time when Babur has just won the Battle of Panipat in Hindustan, 1527. And he has finally, after it's been a long time, and he calls for his harem, he calls for all the ladies, his noblemen who are left behind, his children, he calls for everyone to come and join him after an absence of, I think, almost 2 years. And Gulbadan writes that news reaches Babur that, the royal cavalcade with the women has arrived, we have got your horse ready. And he pushes aside the man and he runs out on foot because he is so eager to see Maham Begum, his favorite wife, to see his child, Gulbadan, to see all his other children. And though this shows the influence of Maham Begum, it also shows Babur's love for his wife, and that in no way diminishes him or makes him less of a man. I think it brings out his vulnerability, his human characteristics. So you see, even the men benefit from us casting a closer look on the women.
So slightly veering a little in a different direction. I have written on Jahangir, is true, and one of the questions that I often get asked, and often actually I would say complaint, is that there isn't enough of Anarkali. Like, where's Anarkali? And to broaden that question for the both of you, as you said, Ruby, jealousy is one of the tropes through which women are seen. So is romance. And I noticed in both of your works, I think, Ira, you say it explicitly, I think in your case I thought it was implicit, a kind of avoidance of romance. I want to know, am I right in that? And if so, why so?
Yes, I said it right away in my introduction, because most of what we know about Mughal women really is about their so-called love life, very much contributed to by Bollywood. In fact, one journalist, when I first brought out the book, said, well, she claims to be, a writer, historian. She hasn't, which I don't. How has she not written about Jodha Akbar, Jodhabai? And I wanted to write back, but we're not allowed to, and tell the editor, tell your journalist not to look at Bollywood so much and read history books, So I very much wanted to stay away by the so-called love aspect of these women, because this is a reduction. Oh, Jesus, that's suddenly gotten very loud. As soon as you talk about their love life, right, it becomes much louder. So there was no Jodhabai. I was not going to talk about that, nor Anarkali or any of the others. The foreign travelers who passed through India were only too happy to add to this lascivious gossip, this bazaar gossip. And one terrible bit of gossip that I came across was that Roshnara Begum, a single woman, as Jahanara was, once entertained 9 noblemen at one time in her quarters. Amazing stamina. And not only not only did she do that, but when her niece, who was jealous of this, asked for one nobleman, she refused. So you see, then the niece was very angry and told the king about her and had her punished. So in this, we see not only the lurid sexual aspect of these women, but their petty rivalry and jealousy. So very much falling into the trope of reducing women to these kind of roles. So this was really the reason why I did not want to indulge in any of the so-called love aspects. The second being that I found very little of I think this is a modern sort of construct, a very romantic love between a man and a woman, that will love forever. These were often pragmatic marriages, marriages which were meant for expediency or to increase territory. There was not always a love angle to it. So I really did not want to reduce the women's role to just being the object of, a man's affection at all. And so I said it in the introduction and a few times, as you have been asked about that. Often.
It does offer a
Yeah.
very refreshing perspective.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
you get rid of the romance and you can certainly focus on many new things.
See, I think love is the subject. I'm besotted by love. Who isn't, right? But the point is, when love truncates the most phenomenal moment, then you've got to probe what love really means. And I've struggled with the question of love here quite a lot. The important point to keep in mind, as Ira was saying, what is the meaning of love in this context? How it's not just a consummation of love between a man and a woman, right? Which is where really legends, tend to take you, and that too is fine. But there's just so many ways in which love is expressed. Love for love for nature, love for the kingdom, love for the landscape, love in which others are observing. So when Noor Jahan and Jahangir get married, there's a description that I really want to read to you, and I played with that description quite a lot, but I'm just going to read you directly from the record. The days of misfortune drew to a close, and the stars of her good fortune commenced to shine and to wake as from a deep sleep. The bride's chamber was prepared, the bride was decorated, and desire began to arise. Hope was happy. A key was found for closed doors, a restorative was found for broken hearts, and on a certain New Year's festival, she attracted the love and the affection of the king. She was soon made the favorite wife of His Majesty. So, hope began to arise. I mean, there's a movement in it. There's a becoming in it. I call the chapter Ascent. Not simply that Noor Jahan walks into the haram, is a bolt from blue, and takes over. History or our lives, do not work that way. The other really important poetic. So she was. Very famous, very important poet, and her poems are collected in 18th century records in Iran and in Bengal. And there's one poem that has not been produced here, which is really pretty magical and sums up this whole notion of love. She calls it 72 Creeds. And 72 Creeds, essentially, she takes after Hafiz writes about it, Rumi writes about it. And the idea is, why is it that there are so many factions when it comes to love for, and by love here it means, it's a mystic illusion, it means divinity. And Noor Jahan plays on it at a very particular moment when there's a lot of fraughtness around her. And so she invokes, Hafiz and Rumi and writes about this. So this is love, in this context. Or a moment, when she goes to Kashmir for the first time. Now, I do not know whether this poem was written in that context, but the context seems to suggest, if you will, that it's an exchange between Jahangir and her about certain buttons and the lowering of the eye and the glance. So there are those moments. As I said, love is the subject, and love for an empress, love in its many accretions, in its many forms.
Love and a kind of partnership. I found that partnership between the two of them, of this sort of mutual affection, mutual enthusiasm, mutual respect for each other, was something very satisfying about that relationship.
Well, which is exactly why I'm saying to you that we should
Yes.
reclaim the love story
Yeah.
between the two of us.
So let me ask you one last question before we open to before I open the floor to the audience. You've both written books about women, of course, and sometimes the argument could be made that there isn't enough material. But both your books demonstrate that if you look for it, there is material to be found, can be written. Still, there is relatively less material. So how briefly do you deal with this in terms of sources and in terms of methods?
Yes, very briefly, just a few thoughts that, we are told, when I began writing this, I was told, how can you even envisage writing a history of Mughal women over 200 years? There are no sources. Now, that's clearly untrue. So it's untrue that there are no sources. There are sources. You just have to, they've been disregarded. Like Ruby has been telling us, Gulbadan's amazing biography was literally lost to us for centuries. And then it was rediscovered in the late 19th century, translated in the early 20th, and that's how it came back to us, English-speaking people here. So women's works are often disregarded, and put aside. They're very fragile. They disappear in the blink of an eye. So you just have to do that little extra work to find. And the voices of women are always so telling. I find that they've been so interesting whenever I come across sources which have been written by women. For example, it is unrelated to Mughal women per se, but about the Ottomans, for example. There was this woman called Lady Montagu who was married to the British ambassador to Turkey, and she accompanies him to Turkey. And she writes this wonderful account of the women of the harem, of the Ottomans. And she says, I went with them to take part in the baths, the hammams. And when the ladies come to help her take off her clothes, they recoil in shock and horror, and they say, you criticize us about the way our men treat us. So in an aside, Lady Montagu was already criticizing, from an English point of view, how Muslim women were being treated. They said, but look at the way the men expect you to be dressed with these stays, because of course she was wearing a corset in whalebone and she was tightly encumbered, whereas the ladies of the Ottoman ladies were in their flowing clothes. So they said, look at how your men treat you. They tie you up in these corsets and you tell us that we have evil husbands. This woman, Lady Montagu, wrote very lucidly about this point. So when you get the words of women, it's very interesting and it gives you a completely different point of view. So for me, it was very amazing, and it completely changed the way I looked at the Mughal world when I read Ruby's first book, Domesticity and Power. So it's important to seek out these words. And sometimes it's in the absences that you see a lot. So when Abu al-Fazl tries to write them out of the histories, that tells you something as well, that he finds it a boisterous and inchoate sort of space that he tries to constrain by calling them chaste. Now, all these ladies, whether they're 3-month-old babies or, toothless grandmothers, are all chaste, no matter what. So that's also very telling. That's his desperate attempt to sort of, bring them within. And so you have to read between the lines, read into the silences, and read women's words wherever they are available.
I think it's a particular kind of philosophy. So just to give you an example from Noor Jahan, everything that I read before writing this book and in my conversations with people, it's not that people did not know her power, but there was what I called a bullet point view of her power. They would always say, she issued nishans, there were coins that were minted in her name. Nobody, of course, spoke about her endless hunting. So that kind of bullet point. The thing I had to do, and I think this is really, I think the image is rolling up your sleeves and going at whatever there is at hand. I mean, that is really essentially this kind of history. The second thing that I do, and I share this with my students all the time, I tell them, look where you habitually don't look. And I'm saying this because the first painting that I showed you, this is a painting that's known to art historians, right? It's been in the public domain. Rampur Raza Library prides at this painting. But where to put this painting? What was the moment? What is the loading of the musket? There's a European colleague of mine at Emory University where I teach, and he's a European art historian of medieval Europe. He looked at this painting with me and he said, Ruby, do you see that she's loading the musket? This is unparalleled, which is, you know, an instance of power in some senses as far as the technicality is concerned. Nishans. 10 of her imperial orders, again, sign of sovereignty, technical sign of sovereignty in Islamic sovereignty. They survive. There were many more. I didn't just say that there were, nishans that were issued. I actually went after reading these documents. And I'll just give you one example. The stamp that she issues, the stamp that she puts under her name, literally translated, Lady Emperor. Right? So there are cues in these. There are little things that you have to go after. One other example, her first marriage comes in bullet points, almost always. She was married to Ali Kuli for 10 years. She was not a nubile chick who was brought to the haram, right? She was 31 years old. She was a widow. She was the mother of a daughter, which is pretty phenomenal, and comes as the 20th wife of Jahangir. But what were those 10 years like, 10 or 12 years? She was in Bengal in the eastern provinces. And she goes there just when Bengal had come under the Mughal rule. So I had to chart this whole context of imperial and provincial relationships into which her husband gets trapped. And then is murdered. And that's how she comes back to Agra. But Bengal, the land of the Bengal tiger, right? The whole landscape will suggest that this is the moment where she really hones her hunting skills. So I imagine Noor Jahan, I always say this, and I thought of this, marrying at age 17, going to the eastern provinces, you think of a soft plant, but when she comes back, here's this majestic olive tree, which means, a tree of wisdom. So you have to think through these things. And likewise about the record. Of course, about the record, I can go endlessly, but I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, because I think people will want to ask questions, and we have about 7 minutes. So,
Yes,
all right, burning questions.
Yes, please.
First of all, it's been a very enlightening discussion. Compliments to all three of you. But one thing which I want to share with you, being a history person and a filmmaker, I did that film on Noori Shamp, where the Noor Jahan Sarai was there. And I hope that you have taken that incident because it's changed her life completely. While going to Lahore, Jahangir died, and there was this woman who was all full of love and affection. She had a throat there against that Noori Shamp waterfall.
Yeah.
So nicely put, where she could have this rainbow falling on her face. So romantic she was. And there Jahangir dies. And then she takes the historical decision that such a keen diplomat she was, that according to Islam, he was supposed to be buried there. But according to diplomacy, declaring his death means losing the throne. So what she did, and that's the only incident in history where a woman has taken that decision that he got his postmortem done, took the intestine out and got it buried, and then took his body all stuffed to Lahore and declared it.
Could you ask the question, please? I'm sorry to interrupt because we are running a little short of time.
So my question is, I find according to the modern times, this woman, a complete modern woman, who had everything in her, the ability to appreciate love, affection, and the ability to really run the whatever state she has at that time, and ability to control all the Baghi Shahzadas of Mughals.
So
I would have preferred a title, Noor Jahan, a complete woman. And I think she's the best documented woman.
Could we?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
She wants to say something, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so that whole episode is there towards the end of her life. And yes, she was a woman ahead of her time. Thank you for saying that.
Hi, my question is for Ira. Is this on? Yeah, or any one of you really. It's about Jahanara and Roshanara. Is there any information on why they stayed single, why they didn't get married? And do you think that has any implications for why they remained as influential and powerful as they did?
Very briefly, there's this misconception that Mughal women were not allowed to marry. That's completely untrue. Mughal women married in each generation, right down the line. But as time went by and it became a very, influential and powerful, wealthy empire, the oldest daughters often stayed unmarried for a variety of reasons. One of which was that there were very few grooms available. They had to marry within, a certain rank, and a lot of the cousins had been killed. So there were not too many options for them. And I have a feeling someone like Jahanara may have preferred to remain single, preferred to remain Pacha Begum of her father's court, the most influential woman in the world at that time, conducting trade, parleying with noblemen, and living her life on her own terms rather than getting married into perhaps anonymity. So that may have been a reason. For the younger daughter, Roshanara, I'm not 100% sure whether she would have preferred to be single or not, but it was still a way for her to exercise a fair amount of power and influence. And I'm sure, in terms of an emotional life, I'm sure there were discreet affairs, which were very far removed from the bazaar gossip that we hear.
Do we have time for another question? Front row, maybe somebody, maybe the gentleman, that lady.
Hi. Small question. In Mughal history, we are told that the power was behind the throne was with the women in the harem, which is a good thing. How is it that none of them ever became the queen, occupied the throne as such? They lack in ambition or leadership qualities?
We've just been talking about the great Mughal of India, Noor Jahan. Did you come in late? Yes. So I'm sorry? She did. That's the point we are talking about, right? I mean, Jharokha is a symbol exactly of that sovereign power. Hunting is a symbol exactly of that sovereign power. Coins are the symbol exactly of that sovereign power. So certainly she did. There are other women. The question is, what do we mean by power, as we were talking about earlier on? I mean, it's not lack of ambition. There's great effectiveness with which diplomacy is conducted, intervention into very complicated moments of succession takes place. So all of these are the ways in which women come into the political scene. The other thing I'll say quickly, and then Ira would want to respond. There's an assumption about the public and the private activities in that time. Whatever women did was deeply linked with courtly politics. So for instance, having children was not a private affair of, between a husband and wife. It was a very important moment in the life of the empire because the empire couldn't have continued without the birth of children. And women were great interventionists, in this process. So there are many forms of power, in other words.
I think we're out of time now. Ira, do you want to say something quickly, briefly in the...
Just to thank you, Parvati, for being a wonderful moderator.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk. I think we're done.